Thomas Keller was a German veterinarian working in the wilds of Botswana. For years, he lived near the central Kalahari Game Reserve, one of the harshest regions in Africa, on an animal rescue mission. This region experienced some of the driest, most unforgiving climates in South Africa. Scorching sun, night frost, and miles of barren land. Every morning, Thomas would climb behind the wheel of his old but sturdy pickup truck, carrying a bag full of emergency medications, IV fluids, and dressings, and set out to check the wildlife's pulse. He had treated dozens of aurochs, several injured leopards, a group of dehydrated wildebeest, and a few lions. But what he experienced that day was different, something that truly shook his heart. It was a scorching November afternoon. Thomas was patrolling the western edge of the central Kalahari. The heat was almost unbearable. The sky was still, there was no wind, and the ground was cracked. He spotted a large grayish mass at the edge of the dried-out bed of a former wetland. At first glance, he thought it was a stone, but something was strange. As he approached cautiously, he noticed its enormous ears, wrinkled skin, and long tusks. It was an African elephant, but not an ordinary elephant. A fully grown male elephant lay motionless on the ground. Its eye sockets were sunken, its ears hanging lifelessly. Its ribs were visible from the outside. Its skin was practically stuck to its bones. Its legs were immobile, and its chest was rising and falling with difficulty. Its eyes were half closed, a vague awareness. Thomas knelt down and approached. He gently touched the massive trunk. At first, he thought it was dead, but suddenly he saw a scream in its half-opened eyes. Those eyes weren't looking at Thomas. They were practically pleading with him. It wasn't the gaze of a beast, but of a being who longed to live, weak but alive, exhausted but unwavering, caught on the thin line between life and death. Thomas immediately grabbed his camera, took the first photo and saved it to send to the rescue center. But there was no signal on his cell phone. He could neither call for help nor reach anyone. There were only two living creatures there now, one a dying giant, the other a man determined to do whatever he could. In that moment, he made his decision. He would not give up. If there was still a glimmer of hope, it would be beneath him to abandon it. This elephant, weighing hundreds of pounds, was a living legend of Mother Earth, and that legend was now waiting for its last chance to cling to life. Thomas rolled up his sleeves and began the rescue operation alone, and that was the moment an extraordinary, life-changing journey began between a human and an elephant. Thomas opened his emergency kit. He prepared the last remaining emergency 4 hydration solution. With difficulty, he found a suitable vein in the elephant's massive body, which lay motionless. Its skin was thick and dry, but he observed the thin line of veins behind its ear. He carefully inserted the needle and began to drip the serum. Then he injected a low dose of antibiotics and painkillers. His heartbeat was irregular, but it was still there. Thomas thought it was a miracle. The elephant's ribs felt stuck to the skin. Thomas removed the thermal blanket he carried and carefully covered the massive trunk. The air was rapidly cooling. Night fell differently in the Kalahari. As the moon rose, loneliness enveloped the silence, and the distant howls of jackals pierced his ears. But Thomas didn't leave. He turned on the truck's headlights, turned the lights toward the elephant, and sat down beside him. All night long, the elephant showed no resistance. Only occasionally did its trunk tremble gently. Sometimes he would breathe deeply, and those breaths would blow silently, like the wind passing over dry grass. Thomas placed his hand on his back and whispered softly, "If you want to live, trust me this time." Even though their eyes hadn't met, a bond had formed. The words might have been meaningless, but their intention was strong, and intention is sometimes the most powerful medicine. At dawn, Thomas managed to pick up a faint satellite signal. With shaking hands, he sent an SOS signal to headquarters. The Wildlife Center responded soon after. They would dispatch a helicopter. They would depart as soon as the weather permitted. The next morning before the team arrived, Thomas took the elephant's temperature. He had administered 3 different fluids throughout the night. He carefully monitored his breathing and used a hose to water his lips, dripping water to ease the pain of dehydration. This massive creature, a giant who had been a symbol of the wild for years, was now clinging to a handful of hope. He decided to give him a name, Tembo. It meant elephant in Swahili, but it also meant something deeper to Thomas: strength, memory, and wisdom. In the middle of the desert, where sky and earth met, there were only a few things: the truck's lights, Thomas's tired but relentless hands, and Tembo's slow-beating heart. But that heart was still beating, and Thomas would never leave him alone under any circumstances. As the helicopter sliced through the sky, the roar of its rotors pierced the dry, desert silence of the Kalahari. Landing in a cloud of dust, the rescue team couldn't believe their eyes at first. Before them lay a massive, exhausted African elephant, seemingly with only a few hours to live. Its muscles were wasted, its ribs were so emaciated that they could barely see it, its eyes still half closed. Paramedics meticulously maneuvered Tembo onto a special stretcher. 4 men climbed under his body, while others protected his trunk and ears. His body was still warm, wrapped in a thermal blanket. He was slowly carried to the helicopter. 4 more IV bottles had been prepared inside. Thomas held each bottle in his hand throughout the entire flight, a full 300 kilometers, and held them steady. The IV flow must not be interrupted for even a moment. It was the balance between life and death. The night was just beginning to dawn when the helicopter arrived at the emergency landing site of the Mon Wildlife Hospital. Leading the welcoming team was the hospital's chief veterinarian, Dr. Ellis McConaughey. He knew Thomas, but seeing an elephant in this condition had overwhelmed even his years of experience. The initial examination was horrific. Dr. McConaughey summarized the severity of the situation. His hind leg reflexes are completely gone. The spine is severely damaged. The muscles are almost gone. His internal organs are also showing signs of collapse. Even if he survives, he won't be able to walk again. Hunting is impossible. He may not even be able to stand. But Thomas remained resolute. "We owe him one last chance," he said. "This is a fight for a living being. He won't be alone in this fight." And with that determination, the final and most risky decision for Tembo's life was made: spinal surgery. The surgery lasted a full 8 hours. During the surgery, the veterinary team worked microscopically to relieve pressure on his spinal cord and minimize nerve damage. Everything was dedicated to estimating even the smallest hope of Tembo getting back on his feet. After surgery, he was admitted to the intensive care unit. Fluid support, antibiotics, and medication continued. Every breath, every pulse was monitored in real time. But there was something else. Thomas. Thomas took a month's leave. He was given an outdoor guest room, but he didn't stay there a single night. He set up a folding camp bed right outside Tembo's cage. He stayed by his side day and night. He started each morning with him. He closed each night with him. Because this wasn't just a rescue operation anymore. It was the story of a bond forged between 2 lives. Tembo's post-surgery recovery was filled with patience and love. In the first few days, it seemed impossible for him to eat. But after a few attempts, they began feeding him a soft fruit and grain puree mixed with a specially prepared electrolyte solution. Thomas meticulously handed each spoonful, carefully watching Tembo swallow. Every bite was a small but precious step on the path to life. 3 weeks passed. Tembo still couldn't move, but his heart rhythm had stabilized. His breathing was calmer, his eyes more alert. Now those hopeless, vacant eyes had been replaced by a kind of awareness. Everyone sensed that this giant still had a strong spirit within him. One morning when the head veterinarian Ellis entered the intensive care room, he paused. His eyes welled up, and he covered his mouth with his hands. He couldn't hold back the tears. Tembo's tail, it was moving slightly. Within seconds, the entire team was in the room. This tiny movement was like a fallen mountain cracking again, a sign of life. Physical therapy was started immediately. The specialist began slowly stretching Tembo's immobile muscle groups. Each movement was carefully planned. His hind leg reflexes were stimulated, and efforts were made to reactivate nerve pathways. It was a long and arduous journey, but Tembo refused to give up. During each session, his eyes searched for only one person: Thomas. Whenever Thomas left the room, Tembo's gaze would immediately fixate on that door. And when Thomas returned, a distinct light would illuminate his pupils. This bond wasn't just between a rescuer and the rescued. It was a deep loyalty born between 2 beings. Over time, the hospital staff also marveled at Tembo's determination. Every step, every movement, was met with hope at the center. It was as if not just Tembo, but the entire team was fighting together. 2 months later, the miracle happened. Tembo took his first steps, albeit with assistance. His massive body rose with a jolt. He planted his front legs firmly on the ground. With his first step, everyone's eyes welled with tears. The moment was shared on social media and quickly went viral. Under the banner, "The Giant Miracle in the Desert," millions watched Tembo's first walk. That giant who had faced death was now a symbol of nature's resilience and hope. Thomas and Tembo were now inseparable. When Thomas reached out, Tembo would slowly lift his trunk, touch it, and make a soft sound, like a baby elephant. Every time Thomas left the room, Tembo would go to the nurses, attract their attention, and gently approach them. Everyone was amazed by the grace within this enormous creature. During physical therapy sessions, Tembo never lost his temper. He never shouted or showed any aggression. Thomas would sometimes tell stories, sometimes play peaceful music, and even leave his tape recorder on when he had to leave the room. Hearing that sound would calm Tembo. For the most important thing for him was not to be alone and to be remembered with hope. And finally the day came. Despite his weakness, Tembo rose of his own volition. With trembling but determined legs, he took his first emotional steps. Not just to walk, to make Thomas proud again. The entire hospital staff was filled with tears and cries of joy that day. Such a miracle of recovery is rarely seen in the wild. Tembo was no longer just a patient. He had become the hope of life. The resurgence of a creature once discarded, deemed unviable, gave the entire team a superhuman boost of morale. Tembo now represented life. He was a symbol of hope, faith, and resilience. In Thomas's eyes, he was not just a creature he had saved, but a reflection of his own inner goodness. And then came that morning. Just before sunrise, as a light fog settled in, Tembo walked toward his cage door for the first time. The staff were confused. As Thomas approached, Tembo gently grasped his shirt with his trunk, then slowly released it and turned and began walking. He was inviting him. He wanted to go somewhere, and only for Thomas to come. Thomas watched him curiously, then followed him silently. The elephant's massive trunk moved silently, pacing the dry forest path. Thanks to their bond, Thomas felt a sense of security, even though he didn't know where they were walking. The walk lasted nearly 3 kilometers. They passed through dead trees and thorny underbrush. The path was difficult, but Tembo pressed on with determination. Thomas followed the occasional giant footprints in the ground. And then, Tembo stopped in a clearing, on a quiet plain within the forest, and he couldn't believe his eyes. Ahead of them was a herd of elephants. Females and calves stood in a circle, nestled together. As Tembo advanced, some of the females approached cautiously at first. Some of the calves hid in their mothers' trunks. But then something happened. Tembo let out a deep but soft sound, a kind of signal of trust, a greeting. "This human is not an enemy," he seemed to say. "This human is our friend." And the miracle happened. The females stood still. No one attacked, no one retreated. It was as if they had been waiting for Tembo. They touched each other. Familiar signals were sent between their trunks. A mother brought her calf closer to Tembo. Thomas, a few meters behind this scene, was literally frozen. This scene in the midst of nature, he watched with his naked eye. It was the kind he'd read about in fairy tales. Tembo turned and looked at Thomas for a moment, then extended his trunk to a baby elephant. This wasn't a farewell, it was an introduction. He was introducing him to his true family, not with his healing body, but with his healing soul. The sacredness of that moment was indescribable. In one of nature's deepest, most protected spaces, a human was silently accepted, inside a herd of elephants, in their space, and no words were needed, because silence sometimes tells the entire story of a life. Thomas stood silently at the edge of the clearing. Witnessing Tembo's reunion with his true family was far more than a professional achievement for him. It was the culmination of a journey woven with hope, unconditional kindness, and the unseen bonds between humanity and nature. And then, he couldn't hold back his tears. To his own surprise, he began to cry. But these tears weren't expressions of grief, but of the deepest emotion on earth, pure awe and gratitude. In the midst of nature, surrounded only by the sounds of bird song In the morning wind, something within Thomas was unraveling. This had healed not only Tembo, but also him. The drive back was silent. When Thomas got into his truck, his first task was to file a report with the International Agency for Conservation of Nature. Tembo's story was no longer the work of an individual. It was a powerful call to action, capable of initiating systemic change. Conservation groups and the Botswana Ecological Board came together after this incident. An emergency aid program has been launched for elephant communities struggling with thirst due to the prolonged drought in the central and sub-Kalahari regions. The project involved the installation of mobile water tankers, large water troughs in grassy areas, and automatic water tap systems. These were placed along migration routes frequented by elephant herds. Thomas and Tembo checked each spot individually. Were the taps working? Was the water clean? Could the animals approach? And yes, on one of the hottest days, a group of female elephants and their calves approached these troughs without fear and drank. They weren't hiding from humans, as if they knew something. It was as if some of the humans were now helping, not threatening. On that stage, Tembo wasn't just an animal coming to drink. He was now a living bridge between two worlds. He brought together both wildlife and conservation teams. His confidence was contagious to the other elephants. In this unforgettable moment, Tembo, walking among people, his trunk played with by young elephant calves, was captured without hesitation. The footage was shared on a world-renowned conservation channel. Millions watched as the poor elephant, once on the verge of death, became a walking symbol of hope. Tembo's story resonated not only in Botswana, but around the world. Now the country is at the center of a new campaign called Tembo's Friends. The goal, to protect wild elephants, find solutions to drought, and ensure the right to life for every living creature. And it all began when one man refused to abandon an elephant. Tembo was no longer just an elephant. He had become a symbol, proving that life could flourish even in the middle of the desert. Thomas not only brought Tembo back to life, but also changed the fate of dozens of elephants threatened with extinction in the sub-Kalahari region. The salvation of one creature inspired the rebirth of a species. Tembo's condition was regularly monitored. He was allowed to live in wide-open spaces untouched by humans. He lived a free life, close to his natural habitat, far from the threat of hunting. And Thomas, he still visited Tembo every month, walking the same dusty paths. He would sit with him, talk to him, and sometimes stay by his side for hours without saying a word. The year was 2019. One morning, news arrived from Tembo's area. That day, Tembo hadn't woken up. He lay quietly in the yellow grass, as if asleep. Thomas was the first to approach him. He knelt down and leaned lightly against that massive trunk. He placed his hand on its trunk and whispered quietly, just as he had whispered in the middle of the desert years ago. "If you want to live, trust me." But this time the whisper was a farewell. Tembo was buried on a hilltop with a clear view of the sky near where they first met. The following words were inscribed on his tombstone: "We trusted each other." People from all over the world attended the funeral. Renowned nature conservation organizations, animal rights advocates, and local residents were all together that day. Because Tembo was no longer just an animal. As the elephant who came back from the dead, he was a symbol of an era, a belief, and a transformation. The story of Thomas and Tembo quickly spread around the world. It was told in documentaries and included in school textbooks. It touched the hearts of a young generation of nature lovers. Because this story isn't just a rescue operation, it shows that animals have feelings, that nature responds to compassion, and that a single person's love can change all balances. And most importantly, if just one person believes in miracles, the entire world can change forever. Thank you for sharing this emotional journey with us. To continue recognizing and supporting nature's true heroes, please subscribe to our channel and don't forget to like the video. May Tembo's memory live on in every heart.